He has spent 94 years playing men who were afraid of nothing. Then Stephen Colbert asked him one question, and Clint Eastwood said something that nobody, not the audience, not the producers, not Stephen himself, was prepared to hear from the hardest man in Hollywood. He said yes. It was a Thursday night at the Late Show. Late October, the city outside already cold and deliberate, the kind of New York night that feels like a deadline. Inside the Ed Sullivan Theater, the lights were warm and the band was playing, and the audience was carrying that particular anticipation that arrives when the name on the marquee is not just famous but mythic. When the person coming through the curtain has been in people's lives so long they feel less like a celebrity and more like a landmark. When Clint Eastwood walked out, the room rose. All of it, every person. Immediately, without prompting, without the warm-up comedian's instruction to stand. They simply stood because something in the room decided for them, the accumulated weight of 94 years of presence, of a face that had stared down cameras and deserts and decades and come out looking like it had been there first. He walked slowly. That was the only concession to 94 years, the pace. Everything else was intact. The posture straight, the jaw set. The eyes, those pale, specific, unsettling eyes, scanning the room with the calm assessment of a man who has walked into 1,000 rooms and decided in the first 5 seconds which direction the exit was. He wore a dark charcoal suit, white dress shirt, no tie, the collar open one button. No pockets square. No flash. The clothes of a man who understood that at 94, with his particular history, the clothes did not need to do any of the work. He sat down. The room sat down with him. Stephen shook his hand, a real handshake, both men leaning in, Stephen saying something the microphones didn't catch, Clint nodding once in response. The nod of a man who has been greeted by everyone and has learned to tell the genuine from the performed. Stephen's greeting was genuine. Clint's nod said so. The first 10 minutes were exactly what the audience expected, and exactly what they needed before what came after. Clint talked about his new film, a lean, unhurried production shot in 43 days on location in New Mexico, with the brevity of someone who understood that if the film was good, the description should be short. He talked about directing at 94 with the matter-of-fact tone of a man for whom this was simply the next thing he was doing, not a remarkable feat to be marveled at. Stephen marveled anyway, gently, and Clint tolerated the marveling with good humor and minimal engagement. The audience loved it. The specific pleasure of watching Clint Eastwood be exactly Clint Eastwood in a late show chair. The same economy of expression. The same complete absence of performance anxiety, the same quality of taking up exactly as much space as required, and not 1 inch more. Stephen asked about the early years. Clint talked about them briefly, selected details, the way old men talk about the past when they have made peace with it, not nostalgically, not painfully, just accurately, the way you describe a road you've already driven. And then Stephen set his cards down. Clint, he said, I want to ask you something. Go ahead. You've spent 60 years playing men who were afraid of nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I want to know, at 94, having actually lived through everything, are you afraid of anything? Clint looked at him. The room was quiet. Yes, he said. Here is where the story splits, and both halves must be held simultaneously. The first half, Clint Eastwood had built his entire public identity on the precise and specific absence of fear. Not bravado, something quieter and more absolute than bravado. The man with no name did not swagger. He simply existed in a state that precluded the normal human response to danger, as if the wiring that produced fear in other men had been removed in him and replaced with something colder and more useful. This had been true on screen for 60 years, across 100 films, in the hands of a dozen directors, and ultimately in his own. The squint, the stillness, the voice so low it functioned as a threat even when the words were neutral, the specific quality of Clint Eastwood violence, not explosive but inevitable, not emotional but geometric, arriving exactly when and where it was supposed to arrive with no more drama than a door closing. America had taken this image and made it a mythology. The lone man, the uncomplicated courage, the certainty that some things were worth dying for and that dying for them was simply the conclusion of a logical sequence, nothing to be mourned particularly. He had played these men. He had also, more quietly, been the man who played them, the man with the mortgage and the collaborators and the disappointing cuts, and the films that didn't land and the ones that did, and the long, complicated middle section of a career that looked clean from outside and was, like all careers, considerably less clean from inside. The second half, he was 94 years old. Around him, the world had changed so many times that the changes had stopped feeling like changes and had started feeling simply like the nature of things, that everything moves and replaces itself, and what remains is whatever is too stubborn or too essential to be replaced. He was both. Stubborn, certainly, and something essential in the way that certain landscapes are essential, present in the imagination before you see them, exactly as expected when you arrive. But his contemporaries were gone. Not some of them, most of them. The people who had known him when he was young, who carried the version of him that existed before the mythology, those people were almost entirely gone. The directors who had shaped him, the actors who had matched him, the crew members who had spent cold desert mornings with him before anyone knew his name. He was still here. They were not. And nobody had written a scene for what that felt like. Yes, he said again, as if clarifying. Stephen did not move, did not speak. Let the yes exist in the room for a moment. What are you afraid of? He asked finally. Clint looked at the middle distance for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking, which is a different thing and looks different on camera, and the cameras caught it. People keep going, he said. People I've known, people who were here and then they weren't, and I'm still here. He stopped, then. I've outlived most of my generation. Directors, actors, people I worked with when I was 25 years old and thought I'd know forever. They're gone, and I wake up every morning and I'm still here. That sounds like a gift, Stephen said carefully. Sometimes, Clint said. And sometimes it feels like something else. Like what? The room was absolutely still. 300 people who had come expecting the mythology and were receiving the man. Like punishment, Clint said quietly. Not always, but sometimes. You outlive enough people and you start to wonder if you've been left behind on purpose, if there's something you were supposed to do that you haven't done yet. And have you, Stephen asked, done it yet? Clint almost smiled, not quite, the suggestion of one. I'm still making films, he said, so apparently not. The audience exhaled, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, the specific sound of 300 people releasing something they'd been holding. Stephen leaned forward, the forearms on desk posture, the full attention posture. Can I ask you something harder? You've been asking hard questions for 10 minutes, Clint said. Go ahead. The fear of not dying, is that new? Or has it always been there underneath the image? Clint looked at him with those pale eyes. The look that had unnerved actors across 60 years of set life, not hostile, just completely without pretense, looking at what was actually there rather than what was meant to be seen. There was never an underneath, he said. That's what you're missing. The image wasn't covering anything. The image was just the job. I showed up and did the work, and the work looked a certain way, and people decided it meant something about who I was. And who were you? Someone who showed up and did the work, Clint said simply. Stephen was quiet for a moment. Then, so the fear is new. The fear, Clint said, arrived with the quiet. When the work slows down and the people are gone and the mornings are quiet, that's when it comes. Not the fear of dying. I've made peace with that. The fear of being the last one who remembers. The words landed in the room like something physical. The last one who remembers, Stephen repeated very quietly. I'm one of the last people alive who knew certain men when they were young, Clint said. Directors, writers, actors. I carry versions of them that don't exist anywhere else. When I go, those versions go with me. That's what I'm afraid of. He paused. Not my own death, the death of what I'm carrying. The studio was completely silent. The particular silence that arrives when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, not because it is damaging, but because it is true, and truth of that particular weight changes the air in a room. Stephen did not speak for a moment. He was not performing the pause. He was inside it. Clint, he said finally, I want to offer you something, and you can tell me to mind my own business. I might, Clint said. You're sitting in front of cameras that will reach millions of people, and you just told millions of people about men they've never met the way you knew them when they were young, before the history books got to them. You just preserved them, right here, in this conversation. Clint looked at him. What you're afraid of losing, Stephen continued, you just gave away, to everyone watching. You just put them somewhere they can't be lost. The room held its breath. Clint was quiet for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, long enough that Stephen didn't push, just waited, the way you wait for something that needs its own time. I hadn't thought of it that way, Clint said finally. His voice was the same low, even instrument it had always been, but something in it was different, slightly less armored. The difference was small. The room felt it entirely. Now you have, Stephen said. A pause. Then Clint said, and this was the moment, the one the cameras caught most precisely, the one that would be replayed. Maybe that's the film I haven't made yet. Stephen looked at him. What would it be about? The people I'm carrying, Clint said, before they're gone. The applause that came was unlike the applause that had greeted his entrance. That applause had been for the legend. This was for the man, 94 years old, still showing up, afraid for the first time of something real, sitting in a television chair and telling the truth about it because someone had asked the right question at the right moment. Clint Eastwood, who had spent 60 years playing men who didn't need applause and would have been faintly contemptuous of it, sat in the guest chair and received it without looking away. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply let it land, the way he let everything land, directly, without deflection, without performance. When it settled, Stephen said, "Will you make it the film?" "I don't know," Clint said, "but I'm thinking about it. That's usually where it starts." "That's always where it starts," Stephen said. After the cameras stopped, Stephen walked around the desk and sat in the chair that had been pulled to the side, not the host's position, just a chair, two men at the same level, the show over. He asked Clint about the films he carried specifically, which director, which period, which version of a person that existed only in Clint's memory and nowhere else. Clint talked for 20 minutes. Stephen later described it as the best conversation he'd had in years. Not for broadcast, just two men in a room after the room had emptied, the cameras dark, the band gone home. At one point, Clint said, of a director he'd worked with in 1962, a man who'd been dead for 30 years. He used to say the only thing a camera can't lie about is a face. Everything else you can fake. But if you put a camera on a face and let it run, eventually you'll see what's actually there. Stephen said he was right. Clint said he was right about most things. I just didn't tell him that enough. He stood up slowly, at his own pace, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, put it on with the careful precision of a man who has been dressing himself for 94 years and has refined the process to its essentials. "Good show," he said to Stephen, the highest praise Clint Eastwood apparently distributed. Stephen shook his hand. "Come back," he said. Clint looked at him. "I'm still here," he said, "for now." He walked out through the backstage corridor at the same pace he'd entered, unhurried, straight-backed, those pale eyes forward. The stage manager held the door. Clint nodded once in thanks, which was everything. The door closed behind him. The episode aired the following Tuesday. The clip, from Stephen's question to Clint's "the death of what I'm carrying," ran just under 3 minutes and was shared more widely than anything the show had put out in recent memory. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the least dramatic version of a profound thing. An old man, plainly dressed, in a television chair, telling the truth about what it costs to be the last one standing. Clint did not watch the clip. He was told it had been shared widely. He said, "Good," and returned to pre-production on the film he was now, apparently, making. Its working title, according to a crew member who mentioned it in passing, "The People I'm Carrying." Stephen mentioned it once more, quietly, in his monologue the following week. "Last Thursday," he said, "a man who has spent 60 years teaching us not to be afraid sat in that chair and told us what he was afraid of. And it turned out his fear was the most human thing in the world, not death, but forgetting. Not ending, but being the last one who remembers." He paused. "He's making a film about it, which means he found the only answer he knows how to give. He's showing up. He's doing the work." Which is, apparently, what Clint Eastwood does. Still, he has spent 94 years as the man who fears nothing. It turns out he fears one thing, the same thing most of us fear, eventually, if we live long enough and love enough people. He fears being the last one in the room who remembers. And in saying it out loud in a television studio on a Thursday night in October, he put what he was carrying somewhere it couldn't be lost. The cameras were still rolling. They caught everything. That was the whole point.